Welcome to the Love Your Inner Athlete podcast, your go-to source for all things mental fitness and sports. Whether you're an athlete, coach, parent, or professional, you will learn as you join us to dive into inspiring conversations with those who have worked to develop their mental fitness. You will hear from people who've put in the work as either an athlete, coach, parent, or professional. In each episode, we bring you discussions and expert insights on developing resilience, focus, and mindset. Discover the concepts of mental fitness and learn how to use it to create consistent, durable confidence in both sports and life. I'm your host, Hans Schulstead. Let's get started. Welcome to the Inner Athlete podcast, where we talk all things mental fitness. Today, we are joined by the athletic director for Bemidji State University, Britt Lauritsen. Britt and I have known each other for a couple of years. So welcome, Britt.
Thank you. Excited to chat with you for a little while.
First question, tell me about how you got into your current role at Bemidji State.
Started out, I was a student athlete my entire life, played sports growing up my entire life, was a soccer student athlete in college, wanted to go to med school. About halfway through my junior year, decided to veer off that path. I didn't want to take the MCAT. My heart wasn't in it. So I pivoted and decided to take the LSAT 6 weeks from that decision date. So I took the LSAT, ended up going to law school at Indiana University in Indianapolis, their Indianapolis campus. Everything about that set of decisions led me to where I am. That Indianapolis campus is a stone's throw away from the NCAA national office. I worked in enforcement with the NCAA for a summer and got to see the inside of what makes NCAA compliance and enforcement and all of the legislative processes tick. And then worked at what was called IUPUI at the time, Division I institution, no football, and then worked at USA Football, which is the national governing body for youth football in the country. Graduated law school, decided that kind of sport path was really what I wanted to do. I got a job at Washburn University in Topeka, Kansas as their assistant athletic director for compliance and a senior woman administrator, and did that for 8.5 years before I took this position at Bemidji State.
That's quite a journey.
Yes.
I did not know about the USA Football thing and the enforcement thing. What you just said, you know what it made my dad joke brain think?
What's that?
That's why you got that fidget spinner, to be an enforcer.
That's right.
Right? The fidget spinner that could double as brass knuckles.
That's why they make it magnetic, multi-purpose.
Yeah. So tell me, what's the best advice you've ever been given for either sports or life?
Oh, wow. I saw that question on your list of questions, and I've thought about it for weeks and weeks. And I think it's hard to kind of distill down. Like everything, I'm probably going to ramble and tell you a story here. So
great. I love stories.
My mom's dad, my granddad, was a longtime athletic coach. He was born in 1913, lived through the Depression, all of that. He coached football and basketball and all kinds of stuff for many years. He ended up being a principal and then a superintendent in our small county in southern Indiana. When they decided to consolidate these 7 local high schools into one bigger high school, which I ended up attending many decades down the road, it was a pretty tough decision for folks. And what ended up happening is at 3 a.m. one morning, right before Christmas, a car bomb went off in my granddad and grandmother's house. My mom was still living there at the time with her siblings. Somebody had been upset about this consolidation. They had tried to set this car bomb for 3 p.m. or 3:15 p.m. when he would be driving home from school. It went off at 3 a.m. They lost everything. I remember when my granddad died, he never really talked about that incident. It's one of those things that my grandmother talked about a little bit, but my mom hasn't really talked about. It was just a really traumatic experience for that whole family. But I remember when my granddad passed, I started reading these news articles. I mean, the FBI was there. They never knew who did it. Like, it was this whole thing of, who blew up the superintendent's house. And I remember reading in this article my granddad's quotes, and he just kept going back to this hope that whoever did it found whatever they needed in life, that they found the comfort, that it was such a loving and caring response that at the time felt completely unwarranted, right? Like in those moments, if you were angry or if you were upset or if you had really strong feelings, that probably would have been warranted for the situation. And my granddad just approached it in such a loving and caring and compassionate way. And I think that really, looking at advice, I think the biggest advice is just watching the way in which my family has approached life and struggle. And I think if I had to distill that advice, I would say love like everyone else will match your energy. I think if you put that out there, if that's, as humans, we match energy all the time, right? It's why we engage in conflict. It's why we get emotional in fights, but it's also why when you have really strong connections, those work well. And I think if you approach life in a way that you put that out, you love like people will match your energy. I think that that's the best way to put your best foot forward. It's the best way to approach a situation. And it catches people off guard, I think, in some spaces too. So, it's not something that was ever said to me. It was something that was modeled for me. And I think that's the biggest and greatest gift that my family, from my grandparents on down through my parents and my siblings, ever gave me, was just modeling that kind of advice.
That is a great story. And you know what I really appreciate about your answer is you are modeling your emotional response to the answer is also modeling one of the things I talk about is that emotions don't have a value. And we got to get better at being vulnerable with one another
Right.
and showing that emotion and that connection and that love. So your answer super really reflected what you were saying. I really appreciate that. How do you use that day to day at BSU?
Oh man, I try really hard to come from a place of, if we show people love and care and respect, that is almost unexpected in today's society, in today's world. People expect so much confrontation. Ultimately, people want to be heard. They want to be acknowledged, and we can handle, as humans, hearing the word no if we are having an intelligent conversation around the word no. In my position, I don't get to tell people yes every day. I wish that I did, but there are always limitations to that, whether that's budgetary, whether that is logistically, whatever it is. I can't say yes 100% of the time. But what I can guarantee is when I say no, we're going to have an intelligent conversation around it. I'm going to hear your side of things. I'm going to tell you kind of what my thought process is. And then we're going to get to a space where even if we disagree about the outcome, we will still agree about how we're going to interact in our space moving forward, how we're going to have a united front, and how we're going to use this to maybe get to a yes down the road. I don't think no's have to be brick walls. I think they are just opportunities to find a different path. So I try to model that behavior, but ultimately, I think with our student athletes and our coaches, the one thing that, if you had to name a legacy, right? We don't get to choose our legacies. We don't get to choose how people remember us or how they talk about us, even when we're here. But you always have a hope, right? And my hope is that my coaches, my student athletes, my staff know that beyond anything else, I have love for them. I have respect for them, and that their humanity is my ultimate priority. And I think if that's what I walk away from at the end of my career, that's a pretty damn good legacy.
So when we first met, we connected and talked about the book, What Made Maddie Run. Can you tell the listeners about your connection to that book and how the book and Madison's legacy or life has impacted you?
Yeah. What Made Maddie Run, I feel like, was one of the first books that was really kind of mainstream in this idea of bringing student athletes and mental wellness kind of into the forefront. Obviously, it was written by Kate Fagan from ESPN at the time. She had written a couple other books, but I think it was so visceral, right? It was in a generation that grew up with social media in a generation that grew up documenting every single bit of their lives. Up until that book came out, I don't think folks who didn't grow up in that generation, I'm a millennial, and so I kind of evolved into it. I didn't start there, but I tailed into it, right, in my college years and now. So I kind of have this 1 foot in, 1 foot out, but every generation behind me has grown up in this space where they are expected to curate a life and curate a persona in a much different way than any of the rest of us had. And so what made Maddie run, and then the ESPN kind of mini documentary that they did really showed what it looked like for that generation of kids to have to grow up in a space where they felt like they couldn't show cracks in who they were and their life. It was it and still it still gets to me how isolating that feels, and that could feel for students to feel so public in everything you're putting out, and you're getting likes and you're getting comments and everything, and be so alone. Depression, anxiety, all of those things. I've talked with my coaches, have been very open with student athletes. Like, I am a human who struggles with moderate to severe depression. I have anxiety. Like, I work through all of that. And I was that kid, right, in college. I had a really, really bad situation in college where my mental health was poor. And so I very much could have been Madison Holleran. And so reading that and reading the similarities in how our stories aligned, it is not abnormal for folks to feel that way. Later on in life, I actually got paired up with a woman through Women Leaders in Sports who grew up with Madison Holleran. Their families grew up together. She knew Maddie really well. That was a family friend. And so the whole idea of 6 degrees of separation, it's maybe 2 or 3 in our world, in the world of athletics. You're really only 2 or 3 degrees separated. And so I think for me, just seeing and having folks be able to see what it was like, it 10 years ago, 15 years ago, now fast forward into 2025, things haven't gotten better as far as how much we live our lives online and how much we curate our lives. And so we have to keep those things in the forefront, and we have to be able to respond to a different type of pressure and a different type of social environment than any of the rest of us grew up in.
So what do you tell your athletes in your athletic department about how to manage that process, that curation process, the identity of who you are on social media and who you are as a person?
I think it's really difficult right now. We have, especially college sports, we have bought in so much, right, into the persona. As name, image, likeness has grown and kind of exploded, you are now giving the reins to 18 to 23-year-olds to utilize that persona and to build that as a brand to potentially make life-changing money. And we know that really only about 2% of those NIL deals are actually life-changing money. The other 98%, you might get some free meals or a couple $100 here and there. But the idea that it could be makes it that much harder to convince folks that you are so much more than that Instagram square. You're so much more than a TikTok or a reel or whatever. And I think more so we have to be, and I try really, really hard with our student athletes to be intentional about how I have conversations with them and to remember things from conversations. I try not to stick at that base layer. Like, if you have said something in a previous conversation that's personal to you or gives me some insight to your life, I'm going to come back to that, because reminding them that those things that they say offhandedly in a conversation, those are invitations to know them better. And they might only extend that invitation once or twice to a coach, to an athletic administrator, to whoever. And if you don't accept it, if you miss it, you miss the opportunity to remind them that they are human outside of social media. It takes intention, and we don't always get it right because we're just as glued to our phones as anybody else at this point, but we have to get it right more often than not.
Well, and what you reminded me of, I remember a client I worked with who went to a perennial, big time, well-known football school, no social media presence.
Mm-hmm.
They recommended he get like an Instagram account, got an Instagram account, and he had not even started fall practice and he had 30,000 followers, which is just insane.
It is.
It's just like, wow. I mean, I understand why, but like that's a lot.
Well, and
I'm
think about this too, and things that people don't think about if you don't work in the space all the time. Like
uh,
everything is so much easier now. It's so much easier to bet on sports, especially college
I,
sports. Remember, 18 to 23-year-olds is who we are working with. Like
yep,
our job is to pump out just better humans at the end of this.
yep,
Ultimately, that is what our job is. But these 18 to 22, 23-year-olds are getting harassed online because people are betting hundreds of thousands of dollars on a football game on a Saturday. And they're getting 30,000 followers in a day, a week,
yeah,
whatever. And then they are hearing about it. The amount of vitriol that comes through social media because of the other ways that the internet and just the world has evolved. Again, those are all things that 20 years ago we didn't need to think about. Our student athletes weren't hearing from folks, I lost $5,000 because, you only scored 8 points or any whatever prop bet is out there. They are not responsible for the livelihood of these other people. But by God, if you look at X or if you look at any of these other places,
yeah,
you would think that everybody is just betting the house on whatever
yeah.
sport.
Well, and it's not like, before it was illegal, you
Mm-hmm.
know, Tony Soprano could only show up for certain people, right? And you had to know Tony or whatever to like, have the bets or make the bets. They couldn't be prop bets and all that kind of stuff like that. Yeah, that's that. And I remember Charlie Baker talking about that at the coaches clinic about how they have what the amount of harassment that athletes get online about that, or even in the stands.
Yes.
Would you say that's your biggest? What would you say your biggest challenge is as athletic director?
I think it's kind of not a lazy answer, but it's an easy answer to say just the changing landscape of college athletics. But I think at the end of the day, it really is learning how to balance what we do on a day to day with what people on the outside think we do on a day to day. I live in a very different space as a mostly Division II department. We have two Division I sports, men's and women's ice hockey, but then we have 13 Division II sports. The vast majority of the NCAA, even at the D1 level, if you're not an A4 school, everybody else is at a very different place than those schools are. And then you look at D2 and D3, and we're still out here really trying to live that mission of student and athlete. Even though student athlete is a made up term, it is a term of art that the NCAA came up with for court, basically, many, many decades ago. The idea is still solid that we are trying to further the educational mission of an institution. We are trying to create a better citizenry by educating our athletes, putting them in leadership positions, giving them leadership opportunities, allowing them space to fail and learn and grow, all of those things that you want to do while also navigating the very public change in what the bigger schools are doing. And that public perception is hard. It's hard with faculty and staff who don't work in athletics because you're only seeing on SportsCenter or ESPN or wherever this really small percentage of what college athletics actually is. And then on the ground here, it looks very different. And I think the dichotomy of those of us who live the day to day in this space and the Ohio States and the Wisconsins and the Texas and Tennessees of the world live in a very different space. And so it's a constant education opportunity for us. I think we need to, as athletic administrators and just as the NCAA as a whole, do a better job and a more proactive job of educating what we do on a daily basis, what our struggles are, what our needs are, and moving forward from there. But all of that, again, while making sure that we're centering our student athletes and their growth and development, because that's first and foremost.
Okay. So we spent a lot of time together. Tell me what you like about the concept of mental fitness.
I think for many years, and I grew up
Yes.
in this space of looking at anything mental health, mental wellness, mental fitness. Mental fitness wasn't even an idea when I was coming up in sport and when I was playing, but it was very much like either you're good or you're not good. And there's no in between, no fluctuation, there's no spectrum to it. And we know from sport that it is rarely you're good or you're not good. There is a practice to it. I liken it to yoga when people say that they practice yoga or they practice martial arts or whatever. There is this idea that you have to continually put in the effort and put the awareness to it to realize results. And that is the same whether you play football, whether you play soccer, ice hockey, whatever. That's why we practice. That's why we do these things. And I think the idea of mental fitness fits into that idea and helps characterize and encapsulate what athletes intuitively already know about their practices from a physical level. And so I like the reframe and I like the refocus of mental fitness versus mental health because it really feels more athletic.
Well, what has the feedback been on that concept when I presented to your teams or coaches?
I think that there's a lot of breakthroughs in those moments, right?
Uh-huh.
Thinking about the student athletes that we have in this generation and the curation of what they see, there is sometimes a lack of recognition of what is absolutely necessary in the moment to move the needle. And I think when you come in and you are really presenting on this base level, right, of how we're looking at holistically the idea of mental fitness, it feels empowering for our student athletes because they recognize that they have the ability to move that needle. They can practice something in that space. I think there's always the worry with student athletes when they feel broken in the mental fitness space that somebody else has to come in, right, and has to fix them. And to learn that there are things that they can do, that there are practices that they can implement on a micro scale rather than this big, I need a sports psychologist to fix my whole mindset. That's they hear about LeBron James, like, well, LeBron has a sports psychologist, but LeBron also does breathing techniques on
Yep.
the sideline, right? You see him box breathing, you see him doing that. You can do that too. We have as a society always treated always treated this idea as a very external thing. If you have a problem, and I think that's the first box that we should probably break down, right? Is it's mental fitness, right? It ebbs and flows and we move through it and we strengthen and we evolve. It's not a problem to be fixed. It is a skill to exercise. And I think once we see our student athletes go through those spaces with you, there is less stigma. There is less pressure, I think, for them to feel like they are an unsolvable puzzle. And there's just more empowerment in the space. So even just from a few smaller sessions, having somebody come in and break it down at a level that feels actionable and empowering is super important.
Great. Well, that's what I hope to accomplish every time I present somewhere. How about your coaches? What have they thought, or how did they see the concept of mental fitness?
I think coaches, it's always an evolution, right? You are seeing a kind of a generational shift, I think, in coaches and just coaching staffs in general. And I've got a really cool mix of coaches who are kind of in that old school, have been here 30 plus years, and then some newer and younger assistant coaches who are very much, Gen Z. The ways in which they interact with one another, I think, has changed tremendously. I see the coaches in the older generations more open to hearing the younger coaches lean into mental fitness and lean into some of those aspects. You have to give some grace to folks generationally who grew up in spaces where sport was not a place to talk about emotion. It wasn't a place to feel your feels. It wasn't a place to do anything but go out and perform. Once you get in between the lines, like, everything else falls away. And we know that's not actually the case. We know that everything outside does affect what happens in between the lines. There is always a shift there that has to occur. And so for some, it's a much easier shift. For others, it's a little more painful, but we're seeing it more as Gen Z comes into being student athletes and being into our teams. Coaching is just like everything else. You evolve or you don't. And if you don't evolve, you get replaced. And it's not a threat. It's just the circle of life, really, in any career. And so I think this is the space where it used to be the evolution was tactical in a lot of sports, and it's still tactical in spaces, but it really is social too. And that's a big piece of the coaching evolution now.
So one of my next questions was going to be, what do you see with the most successful coaches?
Yeah, I think the most successful coaches are able to have conversations and are able to listen. It is a really difficult space, right? If you were a coach, you are coming to me as your boss. I'm expecting you to be the subject matter expert in whatever sport that is. You are going to lead your team. It is difficult sometimes to sit back and listen to a student athlete in a space where you might not have the subject matter expertise. And I think when we're talking about mental fitness and those types of things, some coaches struggle with that because they don't feel like they have that. But the good coaches are the ones who are able to listen and admit, like, hey, I may not know or have an answer right now, but I'm going to validate how you feel. I'm going to validate that that is affecting performance, and we're going to find you what the next step is. I think being able to do that and be open to it and open to feedback, it's just as much for the coaches and their mental fitness too. If you're not in a great place mentally, feedback feels harsher. And you have to be open to feedback, whether it's from me, whether it's from an 18-year-old freshman. You have to be able to evolve and work with that too. So the good coaches are able to take feedback, to tell themselves they are allowed time to process before they react. I always tell coaches, what you say in the 11th second is way better than what you say in the first second after somebody tells you something. So take the 10 and just process it. And good coaches process.
I like that concept.
Yep.
Yeah.
I have 2 10s. One is your emotional 10. Like, if I'm not much of a yeller, I've never been a college coach, but I can yell. But I will use my 10 one time in a semester. Like, I'm not going to constantly come at a coach or at a situation at an emotional 10, because eventually it loses any edge that it has, right? It just becomes white noise for folks. And so I tell coaches, use your 10 sparingly, because at the end of the day, if you use it too much, it becomes a 1. The other 10 is the 10 seconds to process. Like, if we use those 10s in the right way, we're doing pretty well.
Yeah, I'm going to steal that from you.
Go for it.
So speaking of 10s, this will be like one of the last questions, and I feel the emotion coming up in me asking the question. What can you tell me about what you remember most, or talk about the impact you've seen my Aunt Sue have on BSU and my Uncle Steve, and why you think having people in programs like that is so important?
Oh, man. Oh, I love your Uncle Steve. I'm just gonna, I love that man so much. Truly one of my favorite people with BSU. Oh my God, it makes me emotional thinking about just like the best hugs, the best support. I actually took this position right after your Aunt Sue passed. And so I never got to meet her in person. But man, just the stories of both of them and the way in which they support with love. It comes back to what we talked about half an hour ago, right? Is what, like, if you love, like, people are going to match your energy, like, that's the way to go about it. Those two do and did love in a way that just puts that energy out that is just infectious. And I think that's what makes Bemidji State great. I think it's what makes most of those relationships, and what makes college athletics so cool is that we're able to develop those types of relationships with folks where student athletes feel it. They feel loved and cherished, and they feel like family. I try really, really hard to stay away from family as a descriptor in a lot of times, because I think sometimes it gets emotionally hijacked. Like, oh, we're family, so I can be super dysfunctional and I can treat you poorly. Like so I try really, really
Yeah,
hard to
no,
not say
yeah.
that. And I recognize that in space, there is a very particular time where family is a great descriptor. And I think this is one of those where it's not just a love for the school. It is truly a love for the mission and the vision and the values of what that school, those student athletes, those programs represent. And the people who buy into that, like your aunt and uncle, are the ones that carry it forward and the ones that you really rely on moving forward to keep a base of folks who just get it. They just freaking get it.
Yeah, well, and that's the way they live their lives, like very generous, very
Yes.
just very open. Now, I will tell you, and I'm going to say this, hoping that my uncle watches this, is do not expect life-changing money from him. He's a chiseler as as big as chiselers come, and he knows that. But
That
I also know, though, actually, now that I say that, I do know from experience that, I also think like the life-changing money that, Will Howard is going to get, or somebody or Arch Manning or whatever,
right.
right? But at your level, I actually do think at D2 level is that even just paying one kid's scholarship could be life-changing.
I was hoping you were going to say that. We have to readjust what we envision as life changing. That is a societal thing. Growing up in the US, like we have a very, very different lens of what life changing is in comparison with the rest of the world. And I think being at an institution that is predominantly first gen, Pell eligible, American Indian serving, all of those pieces, life changing money is a scholarship. Life changing money is money for books or room and board. Like that is the thing that gets our students from A to B. And I think reorienting folks to recognize that $500 can be life changing. And that is just, we've got to take away again from the Alabama life changing and come to Bemidji State life changing.
Well, back when I was doing in-home, long story short, I worked in a crisis program, and they had a certain amount of money they could spend to get through their crisis. And if you didn't use it, you could take them out to dinner. And so I told this couple that was fairly young, and they said, well, we have a place we want to go, but we're afraid if we ask, you're going to say it's too fancy or too expensive. I said, well, okay, but just ask. And if it's a no, it's a no. And they were like, we want to go to Perkins. And I was like, oh, yeah, we can do that. But to me, that did not equate to fancy or expensive.
Right. Exactly. It is.
Yeah. Well, we didn't get to all of our questions, but I feel like we kind of did.
I think we did a pretty good
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate all the time that I've been allowed to spend up there. And I have built some real quality relationships, including the one with you. Don't ever hesitate. Like, if you're not sure what to do about something, I mean, I have a lot of experience with off the wall things or things that you expect. So feel free to reach out.
For sure. Will do.
Thanks for being.
Yeah, no problem.